Last week I provided a PowerPoint video for you that was created by Purdue University and addressed ways to approach examining poetry to get the most out of it. And today we're going to build on that by being perhaps even more specific, giving you an approach to analyzing poetry. And what analysis simply means is to take something apart, look at its pieces, with the goal to be to have greater understanding and enjoyment of a particular work. Now, I know a lot of English classes are really guilty of analyzing something to death to the point that you feel like it takes the life out of it. I know a lot of students feel that way, and that's really never the goal. Actually, my goal and part of the reason that we discuss these different features of poetry is to make it more accessible so that perhaps poems that you would never personally have found appealing or interesting or even begun to understand will change for you, and that you'll be able to sort of see it more as an insider and therefore can appreciate it. I like to equate it to learning to play basketball, and I'll tell you why. When I was growing up, I loved sports, all sports, and except basketball, because quite frankly I was very clumsy and could not dribble and move at the same time. Now, my brother was all county for our high school, and actually I think he may have been all state. I don't remember. But anyway, but I had the very embarrassing situation when I was 12 years old of being kicked off one of those rec ball, like I think it was a Y League, and the referee literally kicked me off the court because it was so clear that I didn't know what I was doing, that I was a danger to myself and to others. And it really wasn't until I was an adult and I had someone who actually explained the game to me, what the difference between the zone defense and a man-on-man, what setting a pick was, the purpose of the different positions and so forth, that I really started feeling more like I was an insider on the game and came to appreciate it. Now, I'm never going to be able to play it, to be honest with you. That's just not going to happen. I can play a pretty mean game of horse, but that's about it. However, I learned to really enjoy the sport because I understood it better. I understood the components and what made it up. And so that's kind of my goal in having us analyze poetry. The more that you understand about what's going on and can see the artistry of a poem, the more it opens up a whole world of poetry to you. And so we go beyond just our initial I'm good at this, I'm not good at this, I understand this, I don't understand this, and actually it gives you a language in which to begin to look at something and maybe enjoy it a bit more. So that's my goal. As we work through this, this poem, One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, was part of your reading assignment for this week, and it's found on page 589 in your textbook. I recommend that you have it open the entire time as we go through this PowerPoint video, and also you might want to have printed a copy of the poetry analysis worksheet that's also included in this particular folder, because that's actually the structure that we're going to use as we examine this particular poem. We're going to begin by reading the poem aloud, and I recommend that you do this and read through it several times, actually. Very rarely can most of us get a good grasp or understanding of any poem unless it's pretty basic and simple by just reading it one time. This is one of those cases where the more you put into something, the more you're going to get out of it. And so I'm going to read the poem One Art aloud for you. I want you to notice that you don't let the line breaks indicate how it's read. Excuse me, you let the punctuation indicate the reading. So, for example, if there's a semicolon, that's a longer pause. If there's a comma, it's a short pause, and so forth. One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. Now, the first things that you should notice when you're examining a poem is to look at the title, because sometimes the title will kind of decode or give you an idea about at least the poem's content, if not the poem's theme. And our main goal is usually to not only enjoy the language and usage, but also to come up with, to understand the poet's main idea. And so all of the things that we're going to be examining lead to that kind of final point, which is, what was the poet trying to get us to understand from this poem? What was his or her, in this case her, main point? Also, see if you can tell anything about the form. Now, most of us are not English majors, and I'm even English major, and I don't know a lot of the forms, things like sonnets and so forth. But sometimes you can tell a lot about a poem if you know, if you kind of identify its form, if it has one. A lot of contemporary poetry, modern and contemporary poetry, written in the 1900s and now, of course, in this century, is written more in free form style, which means it doesn't adhere to any specific type of format. This particular poem, however, is called a villanelle, and we'll get into that in just a second. Also, if you just take a cursory glance at the way the poem is punctuated, sometimes that can tell you some things. And then finally, look at the date in which it was published. Often, too, that can give you a context and an understanding. Not always, but often. So to look at each of these, let's look at the title. And there are two possible considerations for both words in the title, for one and for art. For one, it can mean one in the sense of, identifying this is a particular type of art. It can also have to do with being one as in an individual, something that a person alone masters. And that's kind of an important idea. I think that helps, that play on the word one, to understand what's happening in this poem. Is if you consider the possibility that it has to do with being alone, one art versus two, couple. And then also the possibilities for art. Art has to do with mastering. And so something that you practice, we tend to think of the word art as something that's elevated, something that, if not one of the arts like music, poetry, and so forth, at least something that's done so much that it's become an art form, that you've gotten really proficient at doing it. And so those two words taken together, I'm not sure at first glance have a lot of meaning, but then going back after we work with the material a bit may be helpful. Now, as I mentioned before, this particular form is a very fixed form, and it's called a villanelle. It's originated in France, I think in the 1600s. And not that you're going to be tested on this or that you need to know it, but I'll explain to you why it's helpful to kind of know the form on this poem. Villanelle is it's very structured. Once again, it consists of 5 tercets, and a tercet is a stanza of 3 lines. And stanzas are simply the way that the lines are grouped together with space between them. So this particular poem has 5 tercets, and then it ends in 1 quatrain, and the quatrain is 4 lines. And very specific lines are repeated, and this is actually part of the form. For example, the line, the art of losing is not hard to master, is repeated on lines 1, 6, 12, and 18, which is exactly how the structure is supposed to be. And then there's another line that's repeated on other specific lines. Now, part of the reason that the villanelle is so interesting is that because certain lines are repeated, there's an insistence. It's as though someone is trying to convince themselves or to convince somebody else that something is true, because certain key lines are repeated over and over again. And so that's kind of interesting for our purposes as we try to figure out what's happening in this poem. Now, just a cursory glance at the punctuation, everything seems to be pretty regular, commas, semicolons, colon, and so forth, with the exception, excuse me, I would suggest of three particular pieces of punctuation. There are two exclamation points, and then there's a dash in line 16. Now, the reason the exclamation points are interesting is one of the things you'll notice about professional writers, both writers of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, is that they use exclamation marks very sparingly. They usually let the words themselves show emotion. So when you have those exclamation marks, they really pay attention to them, because there's a reason that the poet is being so emphatic. So if you look at the placement of the two exclamation marks in this poem, and look, it really draws it's attempting to focus the reader's attention, and we get alliteration there, which we'll get to. It's a sound effect, a repetition of consonant sounds. But in that particular line, it launches this L sound. Look, last, next to last, loved, houses, art of losing isn't hard to master. And it creates a certain rhythm, but the fact that it's calling attention to itself, that losing the mother's watch is sort of a key idea, and we will come back to that as well. And then we come down to that last line where the poet says, or the speaker says, "Write it," like disaster. And the "write it" there is emphatic because it shows someone there's a little bit of stress to this, and I would suggest that she is speaking to her, the persona is speaking to herself. It's like she's insisting to herself, "You're going to get over this." And so that exclamation mark indicates that. And then finally that dash, "even losing you," which actually breaks up the villanelle form a little bit. It's kind of unusual. And it's almost meant to be almost as an aside. Until that point, you'll notice that the poem's been kind of formal in its use of language. It's kind of distant. It's sort of, I would use the word didactic, which means it's like instructional, teaching. But at that point, when the poet addresses the person, not the poet, but the speaker, I'm sorry, and I'm going to make that distinction in a second, addresses the person that was lost, even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love. That's almost like an aside, and it becomes increasingly informal with the exception of one word. So that's kind of an interesting point, because that's where the turn in this poem comes. And we'll discuss turn in just a second. And then finally, this poem was published in 1976. If you look at in your text, the publication date is always comes to the side there. Now, that's not necessarily an indication. It can be an indication of where the poet was in life, because you want to draw a distinction, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, but you want to draw a distinction between the persona or speaker of a poem and the poet, him or herself. Now, it could well be that the poet is representing his or her own feelings in the particular poem, but more often what happens is the poet adopts a certain voice, a certain character almost, and it's told from that character or that persona's perspective. So it can be a danger to assume that Elizabeth Bishop, who died in 1979, this poem was written in 76, it could be a danger to assume that she's later, it's later in her life, and she's looking back and writing this. She might be trying to adopt the voice of someone who's a bit younger. So you have to be careful to distinguish between those two. However, it does give an indication, and one of the things we know, as we discuss in the next slide, this particular speaker is very experienced. It gives every indication that she, and we'll talk about that, has been through a lot. So perhaps the date's a little bit helpful. If you're following along on your analysis sheet, you'll notice the next two things that we're going to take a look at are the speaker, or also known as the persona, and the audience. And a lot of times you can tell a great deal. This requires some inference and some careful reading and analysis, but you can tell a great deal about both who the speaker is and who the audience is. So when you're trying to determine speaker, there's certain questions you can ask. male or female? Can you tell an age range, how old, how experienced, uh, sometimes how educated? What do you know about this particular speaker? And in our case, in this particular poem, there are clues. I think the first one, which would indicate gender, is the speaker saying that she lost her mother's watch. And I'm not trying to insinuate that mothers do not necessarily leave their watches to their sons, but it's more likely that this speaker, you even get the idea perhaps that she wore it. So there's probably more of an indication that it's probably a she, and I think that's the key there. Age range, we know, as I mentioned in the previous slide, that it's a pretty experienced person because she talks about moving a great deal. I've actually pulled some of those lines. Where it was you meant to travel, well, usually people who are, I'm not saying that those who are younger don't intend to travel, but usually when you're older, you get to the point where I meant to do this, I meant to do that. That tends to be something that happens a little bit later in life. Um, Notice that she's moved at least 3 times, so they're loved houses, places that she used to live. I lost 2 cities, some realms I own, and of course that's hyperbole, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the whole idea of being master of your domain, someplace that you felt comfortable. And so this is an experienced person, so probably it would be a good assumption to think that the speaker's at least in her 30s, if not a bit older. Once again, best not to just assume that it's the poet speaking in the later years of her life, although it could well be. And then for this particular poem, there are 3 separate audiences, and I alluded to 2 of them earlier. The first, of course, is you get the sense as the speaker talking, that it's almost like she's teaching. She's teaching this art, the art of losing, and so therefore there would be a less experienced audience to whom she's addressing this information. The art of losing is not hard to master, and so she's speaking as an insider who's had a lot of experience talking to people perhaps who are less experienced. And then when we get into that last quatrain, that last stanza, at that point she addresses the person she's lost. And we know just from what she says that it's someone she's loved. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love. Those are references to someone, to intimacy. And so you get the sense that this is someone, not just a family member, but someone that this person was in love with. And then finally, that last parenthetical comment, write it. She's talking to herself, and there's a hint of desperation there. That's what the exclamation mark indicates, is almost a desperation. So that would be the third audience. She's talking to herself. I'm going to get over this. Okay, now we're going to talk about tone and mood, and they mean different things, but they may actually be the same thing. A tone is the attitude the poet has towards the subject matter, and there are usually hints of this. You look to the word choice and to the meaning behind the words to understand tone. And then mood is the atmosphere the poet wishes to create for the reader to experience. Once again, they may be the same or they may vary, and often in poetry, the tone and the mood may start as one thing, and then as you progress through the poem, as things change, the tone and mood may change, and I would suggest that that's what happens in this particular poem. You use adjectives, descriptive words, to determine tone and mood. So things like bitter or bittersweet or loving or compassionate or angry or ironic. A lot of the poems we read are going to have an ironic tone to them, to kind of get a feel for what's happening. And so I would suggest that the tone in this poem is essentially ironic, because in truth, if through careful examination, what we find is that the poet means the opposite of what the speaker is saying. The speaker is trying to treat this information, losing. I've lost so many times, I can't, it doesn't even bother me anymore. I can even teach you how to do it well. But the truth is that the last stanza betrays the truth, which is losing is hard, losing is painful. And of course, we know that that's true. Any of us who've ever moved much or lost things we cared about, we know that the reality is that it's very difficult. Now, the mood initially is didactic, I would suggest. And didactic, once again, just means teaching, instructional. It starts kind of light, actually. The use of contractions makes it a bit more informal, so it's conversational. And you'll notice it's very kind of offhanded, just the art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. And so it's treating very serious subject matter in almost I don't want to say light-hearted way, but almost in a detached way, objective might be the better word. But by the time we get to the end, it becomes increasingly subjective and a little bit more desperate. And that would be, I would suggest, the mood of that last particular paragraph. There's something with the exclamation mark, with the parenthetical comments, the joking voice, the gesture I love. There's something that indicates sort of a desperation there. And even the inclusion of the word, it's broken that line. The art of losing is not hard to master. Suddenly it's not too hard to master. And so the person's kind of revising the speaker is revising what she said earlier. And then that write it has that sense of determination and desperation, as though I'm going to get over you. So those would be my suggestions for the mood, which changes, and the tone, which I believe is essentially ironic, because losing is hard. Now we're going to save theme to the very end, because essentially you arrive at theme after you've examined everything else. Sometimes you get a feel for what a poem's about, and on face value, if we believed that this speaker meant exactly what she said, then we would say the theme of this poem is the art of losing isn't hard to get over, isn't hard to master. Just do enough of it and you learn how. But that's not at all what's happening in this poem, and so it's only through careful examination that we come to that point. So we're going to save theme until the end, and instead we're going to look at the pattern and the turn. Now, pattern is not the same thing as form. We talked earlier about form being things like sonnet form, haiku, villanelle, particular poetic forms that we may or may not be familiar with. In this case, what we're looking at is how the ideas themselves are arranged, and to see if we can see some pattern. Some poems are arranged in a question-answer format, where there's a question asked and then answered. Some poems begin very generally and then move to the specific, or vice versa. Some poems are circular. They start at a certain point and then they take a journey, and then the very end comes back to that original point. Poems can start with very large ideas and move to very small. Poems can start talking to a very general audience and then end up talking to an audience of one. There are all types of possibilities there, and sometimes understanding the pattern helps you to understand the poem. Now, in the art of losing, one of the things you'll notice is that it begins with very small ideas. So the idea, when she says lose something every day, the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. These are small things. Frustrating, yes, but small. But then she broadens that to larger, bigger things, places and names and houses. My mother's watch, that's kind of an important point, as we mentioned before. Houses. Cities, realms. I mean, the ideas get larger and larger. I've lost continents, places that I used to, and that, by the way, is an example of hyperbole, which we'll talk about later. And so, if we recognize the fact that this is getting, these losses are getting larger, then what we find is in that last stanza, this is the largest. Even losing you, this loved one. And that's a real key indication of what's happening in this poem. So by understanding the pattern, we get there. Also, most good poems have a turn, and the turn is where there's a change in direction. Everything to a certain point is sort of building and moving a direction, and then suddenly it takes a turn. And once again, it usually comes, if not in the last stanza, pretty close to the end. That's the reason in sonnets, when we talk about the sonnet form next week, we'll take a look at the fact that most sonnets, the reason that if you understand how the sonnets, what the type of sonnet it is, and how it's put together, it's easy to find the turn, and therefore understand better what's happening in the poem. So in this case, the turn does start in that last line of the last stanza, even losing you, because until then, what we have there is a shift in mood. We have a shift in address. We go from a very general audience to a very specific one, a direct address to someone specifically. We suddenly have the person's thoughts, the speaker's thoughts encapsulated in those parentheses. So that's where everything changes. And that's an indication to us that the ideas have changed. So once again, finding the turn helps you decode the message. Now we're going to cover a lot of terms quickly. And if you've had high school English anytime in the past few years, or if you remember high school English, I'm sure that a lot of these terms are familiar to you. So we're going to go through them quickly and then pull out any that may apply to this particular poem and see what they add to the poem. Metaphor is a comparison of two unlike things, and it's a direct comparison. It's a strong comparison. He's a lion. Obviously, what you're doing with that metaphor is you are trying to indicate that the person has the characteristics of strength and being regal and whatever else we associate with a lion, fierceness. Now, a simile is a comparison of two unlike things using the words like, as, or resembles. And what happens is that notice that it's not that you weaken, it's more of a suggestive comparison in that case. He's like a lion. You tone it down just a little bit so that it's sort of a weaker comparison. Then personification is where you take any inanimate object or any non-human object and you give it human characteristics. So for example, when you say the flowers danced in the breeze, flowers don't technically dance, but that's a very poetic way of talking about their movement, and so that's giving flowers human characteristics. Now, you may not be familiar with the term meiosis, but meiosis is understatement in order to create a certain effect. And the poem, The Art of Losing, the poem One Art, is full of understatement. It's downplaying things that are very serious. The art of losing is not hard to master is meiosis. It's because, of course, the truth is the opposite. The poem is also full of hyperbole. Hyperbole is over-exaggeration. So it's taking something that's that's sort of smaller and exaggerating it. So, for example, when the speaker says, "I've lost whole realms," well, of course, she was no king or queen over an area, but what she's doing is using exaggeration to indicate that there were places that she felt very much at home, and that were like her. It's like the old Seinfeld show where they used to say being master of your domain. If you ever watched that show or heard that term, the idea is that you were queen of all you surveyed or king of all you surveyed, and so that's hyperbole. Now the symbols, your sheet indicates that there are two different types of symbols. One is called universal, and you've already had information about universal symbols. There's a tendency when we see these symbols like the four directions or seasons to interpret them in the same way because that's how they tend to be used. And then not symbols are actually symbol systems created by a particular poet or a particular author. For example, the poet William Butler Yeats used the spiraling gyre, which is actually a movement that looks like a cylindrical tornado on paper, and he used that to indicate time. He had this whole system worked out in his head about 2,000-year systems, and he used that spiraling gyre to indicate how things would sort of narrow down over a 2,000-year period to a certain point and then broaden back out again. So that had particular meaning to him. He also used swans a lot, which became highly symbolic for him of certain things within the Irish Revolution. Um, so not symbols, once again, are symbol systems that are particular to a particular to a writer or a poet. And when we refer to illusions, there are essentially four types of illusions: historical illusions, mythological illusions, biblical illusions, and literary illusions. And these are references within a text that are not explained. So the poet or author just assume that you will get the reference. In other words, they don't incorporate that particular, say somebody mentions Zeus, Zeus's thunderbolt. That would be considered illusion if the poet or the author does not explain to you what that means specifically. So in other words, it's incorporated and it has this whole set of this understanding if you understand the illusion. Okay, all of those are examples of figurative language. They mean more than literally what they say. Okay, and then on the right hand side of your screen are a list of different sound effects. The first one being alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds. So notice it's the sound. So K and C can have a hard C has the same sound as a K, right? In words that are close together, and that's to create a particular effect. Professional writers do this intentionally to create rhythm, to emphasize a point. For example, if you read poems about the sea, you'll often notice there's a lot of WH sounds, whooshing, W's and WH sounds, and the point of that is to mimic wind or waves. And I use that old tongue twister, she sells seashells down by the seashore. All of those S's are examples of alliteration. Now, our poem, One Art, contains several places where there is alliteration. The F sound in the third tercet, then practice losing farther, losing faster. Notice what happens here with that rhythm is it actually makes the rhythm faster. And so that's intentional on the poet's part. And I pointed out in line 10 before, I lost my mother's watch and look, my last her next to last of three loved houses went. That creates also a certain rhythm with all of those L's. And once again, the idea there is speed. It's like having things speed through your fingers. So those words in no way, they actually enhance the idea of speed rather than slow it down. Now, I've read poems that have to do, for example, there's this poem about Cupid and having to do with Cupid being a bully boy who beats up on people. And there are a lot of B's, harsh B sounds, BR, B, BL. And the idea there is it's like blows. Literally, the way the poet puts the words together, it's like being beaten. Because of the emphasis on the words, it slows the rhythm down, and they're very hard sounding. And so that's an intentional sound effect. Now, assonance, anytime you have rhyme, you have assonance. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. Notice it's not just vowels, it's vowel sounds. So she loves sweet tea. You have three long E words there, she, sweet, and tea. And often that too creates a certain rhythm. Onomatopoeia, for those of you who are familiar with the old Batman cartoon where the boom, crack, pow, zowie, all those sounds. Onomatopoeia are words that mean the same as they sound like they would mean. So sizzle is a great onomatopoeia word, and I'm sure you can think of many. And then finally, the last two terms, if you've ever taken a class in music, band, chorus, you've probably heard these words, cacophony and euphony. Cacophony are sounds that are discordant. They're harsher to the ear. for example, K sounds, F sounds, hard G's, G, G, B's, and so forth. There certain languages are cacophonous. They are harder sounding. Slavic languages, German, with all the emphasis on the G's and F's, tend to be a little bit harsher sounding versus euphonious languages. And those are euphony are words that are actually softer and more pleasing and more pleasant. So SH's and S's and P's, once again, they're softer sounding. And euphony are words that are pleasing to the ear, just like if you think in terms of a musical composition that is pleasant and softer to hear. This is a screen for the Siren Song Wiki. I just wanted to show you what it looked like when you entered it. So this should be your perspective, and then under the welcome, I just have this, use this wiki to analyze the poem. It tells you what page, and you can either add to somebody else's information or interject your own. Now, when I select all, what will be listed here are all the entries that people have included so far. And you'll notice I wanted to start us off, so I started with the mythological illusion. So if you click on that, and here's my comment. Obviously, this poem builds on the Greek mythological illusion of the sirens, half women, half bird nymphs who lured sailors to their deaths by singing hypnotically beautiful songs. Now, I took this directly from your book, and then I made my comment. However, we can tell from the language choices, Will You Get Me Out of This Bird Suit and Feathery Maniacs, that this is a modern retelling. And I could have said a lot more than that, but I wanted to leave other people to build on that idea if they wanted to. So once again, the goal of each of these wikis is to have you think through parts of this analysis. You can use the sheet because you do have that assignment to choose one of the 3 poems and do exactly what I did with One Art, which is to work through it, complete the sheet as best you can. But you may use the information that you find in these wikis to help you. And so the assignment is that you are to contribute to at least 2 of them. And you'll notice if you select New Entry, and it will open. And what I did was under tag, instead of leaving my name, I just put mythological illusion. And I also added information right here to tell you the type of information that I was going to include in my comment, and then you type your information there. So once again, the goal of these is to have each student have access to analysis to help you analyze and to read what other people have done and to add your own thoughts. So hopefully you'll find this helpful.